We have heard that Ireland is becoming an increasingly hateful country. We're being told by politicians that some elements of our society are rapidly becoming so backwards and barbaric and bigoted that you and I can't be trusted to speak freely anymore without the ever-present threat of the state hanging menacingly over our heads like the sword of Damocles to keep us all in check. That's the narrative that we've heard from politicians. So how odd then that earlier this year, the same Irish government published a piece of research which found that the vast majority of Irish people are highly tolerant of other religions, races, ethnicities, genders, sexual orientations, and more. In fact, they said, and I quote, "Overwhelmingly, people hold positive attitudes across most of the equality groups and towards the newer communities in Ireland." That's a quote from June of this year, according to the Irish government's own commissioned research. And they said this around the time they were trying to bolster the case for their liberal immigration policies. So in other words, when politicians are promoting their hate speech legislation, they tell us that the country is trending towards becoming a vile den of extremism and hatred. But when they're promoting open borders, they say, well, of course Irish people would support this. Ireland is a shining utopia of peace, love, and candy-coated raindrops, don't you know? And that status seems to oscillate backwards and forwards depending on what is most convenient to politicians at any given moment, in a phenomenon that can only be described as Schrodinger's bigot. So I think that somebody needs to get their story straight, quite frankly. Now, when it comes to the hate speech legislation that we're seeing not just in Ireland but across the Western world, we need to think about the cultural context in which this is arising. Because proponents of these laws will tell us, oh, don't worry, this is only going to deal with the most extreme kinds of hateful rhetoric. It won't impact on normal people's day-to-day speech in any way. But I want you to think about how hypersensitive our society has become to even the mildest of statements. And in particular, I'm thinking of an incident from just last year in Ireland where one politician, Michael Healy-Rae, was accusing another politician, Leo Varadkar, of being out of touch with ordinary people. How many people remember this? Yeah. Now, if you remember, Healy-Rae's way of expressing that view was to say that Varadkar was away with the airy fairies. And Varadkar clearly took offense to this, and he later suggested that this was a homophobic remark because it contained the word fairy. Now, does anyone here seriously believe that the very common Irish expression of saying someone is away with the fairies has anything at all to do with the person's private life or sexuality? Does anybody believe that? Yet, Varadkar, who is an intelligent man, he's an educated man, being a trained medical doctor, even he interpreted that statement in a radically different way than you or I would. And in fact, he even seemed to imply that Healy-Rae should consider apologizing. And by the way, I'm very glad to say that Healy-Rae did not apologize, and good for him if you ask me. But while I absolutely believe that Mr. Varadkar may well have genuinely misinterpreted what was meant here, this incident reveals just how vague and nebulous these concepts really are. It proves that you can say something that most of us would consider to be totally mundane and benign, and someone else can view it as highly offensive. And this case, as we know, is far from unusual. In the modern era, we're constantly seeing people being dragged kicking and screaming through the courts of public opinion because they made a joke or they expressed a normal view that's deemed hateful. And now the government wants to take these cases out of the court of public opinion and into the actual courts. So now when you say something that's politically incorrect, you won't just be getting dirty looks at the water cooler at work. You won't just be getting into an argument over dinner with your family. You'll actually be in front of a judge fighting for your very freedom. So at the very best of times, this law would be seriously flawed. But in our current cultural climate, it is asking to be misused and overused. It's a recipe for disaster. And the thing is, the general public knows that it's a recipe for disaster. Because as some of you may know, a couple of years ago, the Irish government did a series of consultations asking the public what they think of hate speech laws. And in reply, they received thousands of responses from ordinary citizens like you and I, which the government seemed very proud of at first. Oh, they were delighted. They were actually taking to social media to brag about the deluge of responses, as if this was a great success for them. And they seemed to imply that it was positive. And you know, I think they probably only did that because they assumed that nobody was going to go to the trouble of reading through all those messages. And they wouldn't have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for that meddling Gript organization. Because I read through every single message, all 3,600 of them, tallying them up as I went. It took many painful hours. And at the end of that grueling process, what this research uncovered was that about 73% of the individual responses to the government's own consultation were negative. Now, as you might expect, the vast majority of people also said that violent speech and calls to violence should obviously be illegal, which is actually quite handy in a way, because it already is illegal and it has been for decades. So it's a bit like when you go looking for your phone only to realize that it's been in your hand the whole time. The problem has spontaneously solved itself and we can all go home, mission accomplished. Because of course, if someone is openly inciting violence against another person or a group of people, that's clearly not acceptable. And we all agree with that, don't we? But when it comes to merely rude or offensive speech, about 73% of respondents said that the government should not intervene, because there is no objective way to legislate for offense or hatred. Who gets to decide what's hateful? That was the general sentiment of the replies. Moreover, the last major poll on this subject in Ireland was carried out by a Morocco polling a couple of years ago at the behest of RTE, and that research also found that the vast majority of Irish people oppose these laws. And then when you ask politicians, as I have done, to provide some contrary evidence and prove that the public wants this, I can tell you from experience, they draw a total blank. They give you a kind of 1,000-yard stare like a war veteran having a PTSD flashback. Because there is no evidence. All available data shows that these laws are brutally unpopular. And so, faced with these facts, the government heard the Vox Populi, and they listened. And they said, you know what, lads? The people have spoken, and whether we like it or not, we're only humble public servants at the end of the day, here to grant the people's wishes, so let's obey the voters. Is that what they said? You must be joking me. Of course they didn't say that. What do you think this is, some sort of representative democracy? The last time I checked, none of you run an NGO. You're not a European commissioner or a foreign diplomat. You're just tax-paying voters. Why would they listen to the likes of you? And so, having received this overwhelmingly negative response, the politicians drove ahead with their law anyway. Which sort of makes you wonder, what was the point of having a consultation, the key part of that word, of course, being to consult, if you then brazenly disregard the results once you get them back? In hindsight, what was this exercise other than a failed attempt to launder false support for what is clearly an unpopular policy? They clearly just rejected the result because they got the so-called wrong answer in a Nice or Lisbon-esque fashion. In fact, as one response said, one of the submissions prophetically said back in 2019, quote, "It doesn't matter what anyone says, you'll do what you want regardless." That was a real submission to the Department of Justice, if you can believe it, from a few years ago. Now, did they call it or what? Let's have a round of applause for that person's foresight, wherever they are. So we know what side of this issue the public is on. We know what side the politicians are on. And it's at this point that I'd like to address my colleagues in the media. Because not only has most of the press been silent about the potential threat that this kind of legislation poses to free speech, but most shockingly of all, we've even had major news publications urging the government to proceed with the censorious legislation and egging the politicians on. Now, I'm not here to condemn all mainstream media journalists, because I've actually gotten to know these people, and I know that many of them are good and well-intentioned at heart, and I really do mean that. But the press has a sacred duty to the public to speak about issues that matter, come hell or high water. Our job as journalists is not simply to be establishment stenographers who rewrite press releases and regurgitate government talking points. Our job is to afflict the comfortable and to comfort the afflicted. And you can't possibly look at the level of public backlash to state overreach across the Western world in recent years and tell me with a straight face that the media has done this issue justice. When it comes to our fundamental rights, the press's conduct for the past several years has been nothing short of shameful and a dereliction of duty of the worst kind. It's no wonder why journalists have been receiving more pushback and hostility from the public lately. It's no wonder why news media is struggling financially as an industry, because for a long time now, people have not felt represented by the media. The journalists don't ask the right questions. They ask about pointless minutiae and irrelevant logistical nonsense. They sideline the important issues that really matter to the people. They ignore critical conversations about topics like immigration and gender issues and many other things that impact normal people on a day-to-day basis. And worst of all, they routinely attack and demonize their own audience as bigots whenever the public justifiably complains about this. And then they wonder why journalist has become such a dirty word. Now, I can't speak for anyone else here, but on a personal note, I'd like to make it known that as a journalist, and more importantly as a free man, I see it as all of our solemn duty to speak our minds and to say the things that we believe to be true, consequence be damned. And so regardless of what happens in the future, I will not comply with any legislation that seeks to control or compel my speech, and there is no law or government on earth that can change that. Because politicians didn't give us the right to speak. We were born with it. That right comes from a source higher than any state, and no politician or judge has the authority to take it away. And especially not in a proud country like Ireland. Because Ireland is not just an ordinary nation like any other. We shouldn't think of ourselves as just some island on the periphery of Europe or a suburb of Brussels. Ireland is the crowning jewel of Western civilization and the guardian of the spoken and written word. We are the people who preserved Europe's books during the Dark Ages after the fall of Rome, as Europe was being pillaged by barbarian tribes like the Visigoths and the Vandals, uncivilized thugs who burned libraries. And who is it that protected Europe's books? Who preserved the world's knowledge and learning? It was humble Irish Christian monks who took the great works of European civilization back to Ireland and copied those manuscripts to preserve them for the benefit of future generations like us here today. And they often did this at great personal risk. These pacifist men lived in hostile and foreign lands among murderous headhunters who engaged in human sacrifice. And the monks would go into this danger to retrieve books and bring them back to remote islands like Skellig Michael and Inishmore, where they would be cradled safe in Mother Ireland's breast. That is the proud legacy of this island. That is who we are and where we come from as a nation. Irish men and Irish women are a brave and civilized people who would gladly die to preserve knowledge and ideas. And so for this island of all the world's nations to abandon that proud tradition and begin censoring words that some people find unpalatable, well, that's just not Ireland. It would be to become like the Vandals that we once stood against, rather than the brave defenders of speech that we always were and we were always meant to be. So let us do, in a small way, for future generations, what our heroic ancestors did for us. We owe it to those who went before us and to the unborn generations of Irish men and women yet to come to take that torch of freedom that has been so carefully handed to us and to carry it boldly. And that is our task today. God bless Ireland and Aaron Gabra.